So we got a great program. First, let me thank the folks at Terrapin for putting this event together. I think this is really going to be a great event. We have a number of really compelling presentations, a lot of great data you're going to see. My job is to kind of set the stage for you. And so what I'm going to do is try and give you an overview of my perspective on the market. Here's what we're going to talk about. First, I'm going to do a couple slides on regenerative medicine because from my perspective, cord blood fits within a broader field. And the broader field that cord blood fits in, of course, is the field of regenerative medicine. It is one of the fastest growing areas of a major portion of that field, which is cell therapy. So we'll talk very little about regenerative medicine and where the market is today. Then we're going to look at some key cord blood market metrics, both national to North America and international, look at therapeutic applications, and then the couple of cord blood business models. Now, I'm only going to hit very at a high level on each of these themes because there's some fabulous presentations coming after me, but I hope to try to set the stage for those presentations. So let's get started. The field of regenerative medicine, as I'm sure all of you in the room know, didn't spring up yesterday despite some of the stuff you see in the popular press. We're building off of 50 years of research. We've been doing bone marrow transplants for over 40 years, and the first cord blood transplant, of course, was done in the 80s, in 1988, by Eliane Gluckman and her team in Paris. The regenerative medicine market has grown pretty dramatically in the last 10, 15 years, and we're at a pretty interesting spot right now. It really is a mature market. We've got compound annual growth rate in revenues. Revenues growing from 1.6 billion to 20 billion. A fair amount of clinical activity out there. Probably the best measure, I think, of a health sector, a life sciences sector, is the level of clinical activity. If you were to go on clinicaltrials.gov and pick your favorite search term, whether it's stem cells or it's cell therapy or mesenchymal cells or cord blood, you would get a phenomenal number of hits. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But overall, there are about 4,100 new clinical trials involving regenerative medicine technologies, and of those, about 650 are in late-stage development. A lot of commercial products on the market, and this is an international effort. 700 companies. Proteus maintains a database of all the companies working in the field. We've got over 700 companies now in our database, and it is very much a worldwide effort. So the field of cord blood fits within this framework, and it is a broad and maturing framework. So, okay, here are some of the key metrics on the cord blood market, and I'll go into detail on a number of these. Market size, pretty big market right now, about 3 billion, 3.4 billion, growing at a compound annual growth rate of 27%. Right now we have about 125 private cord blood banks worldwide and 145 banks that are public. Now I use public in quotes. Some of these banks are private banks that make donations or put tissue up on a registry. In terms of purely dedicated public banks, I'm not sure there are 145, but I know there are 145 different banks that contribute to one or more of the registries worldwide. These banks are located in 26 countries. Over 590,000 units are now available worldwide in the public banks, and over 1 million units in the private banks. Market penetration varies dramatically depending on what sector you're in. The average is somewhere between 1% and 6%. Interestingly, in the southern European countries, in Spain and Portugal and Italy, market penetration is actually more on the order of 20%. The average fees, $1,700 for collection, $125 annual fee. The fee for public banks right now, if you're selling a unit of cord blood into the international market, the fee that you will receive for that unit of cord blood is about $35,000. And right now, utilization rate for public banks across the board is kind of coming down just a bit. You'll hear more on that from the folks at the NMDP, but it ranges between 1% and 3%. Where are the banks located? Worldwide. Okay. The majority of the banks are in the US, in Europe, and in Japan, in Asia. But here's a pretty good graphic on where the banks are located. 4,000 units were used in cord blood transplants in 2011. And this is where you can see a fairly rapid growth of units being used in transplant. One of the themes you're going to hear from me today and from others as we're going through is the relatively rapid increase in the use of cord blood and how cord blood is supplanting other tissue as a tissue choice for transplant surgeons. Okay, who provides most of the cord blood? Most of the cord blood is coming from the US and Japan. Over 70% of the units that are listed on international registries are coming from US and Japan. Well, where is that going? Where is that tissue going? The largest portion of that tissue, again, goes to North America and to Asia, with Europe a close third. Okay, so, and what this says, the implicit message here, oops, sorry about that. The implicit message here is that we have a very vibrant international exchange of cord blood tissue. We've got 26 countries listing tissue on various registries, and those registries provide a significant flow of tissue across borders. I think it's something like, on average, 3.5, 3.6 cord blood units cross an international border every day. So that's a pretty active field. Okay, a couple of other metrics. How many transplants are we doing? We did 4,000 last year. We're on track to do more than 4,000 this year. Projections are that we'll be up to 10,000 a year by 2015. Despite that relatively rapid growth in the number of cord blood transplants, we still have a very dramatic unmet market need. Over 50% of the patients looking for a match cannot find a match. And if you're a member of a minority community, various ethnic groups have abilities to identify tissue at different rates. So that number can be as high as 70%. If you're a member of the African American community, you have a hard time finding tissue. This is the fastest growing segment of the cell therapy market, and the cell therapy market is the fastest growing segment of regenerative medicine. So you guys are working in a field that is literally right on the cutting edge. Probably the most dramatic growth within the life sciences sector. If you had to pick a single sector within all of life sciences, it might be immune modulation for cancer, but cord blood would be a close second. Okay, the regulatory framework, as I know you all know and may be painfully aware, has changed pretty dramatically in the last 12 months. The FDA has now requiring full regulation, or now has imposed full regulations on public banks. And my view is, and I think we'll hear from folks from FACT or the AABB, I suspect that the regulations that have been imposed on the public banks will eventually migrate down to the public banks, to the private banks, through the accreditation agencies. There are over 60 therapeutic applications for which cord blood is currently being used, and we're going to have some wonderful presentations today and tomorrow on those therapeutic applications. And again, the measure of a field in life sciences, the maturation of a field in life sciences, can be directly traced to clinical trials. I went on clinical trials on the FDA website last night. I do this before I give a lot of speeches. Before I give a speech that talks about cell therapy or clinical trials in some capacity, I have to update this data because it changes so dramatically. If you go on tonight and just Google cord blood on the FDA site, you're going to get over 670 hits. You'll actually get quite a bit more than that, but you have to filter out a couple of the trials for which there's unknown data. If you just take trials for which there is active data, 670 trials. That's a significant number of trials. 450 of those involve therapeutics. The rest, of course, are around expansion and collection technologies. And 96 of those are in phase 3, phase 4, and pivotal trials. So we're going to be seeing a push of new therapeutic applications for cord blood coming down the line, and that includes traditional, quote, regenerative medicine applications like PVD or CLI or cardiovascular or stroke or spinal cord. Cord blood, as I think most of you know, has typically been used in blood disorders, but we're now seeing a migration of this technology into other therapeutic applications, and it's happening pretty rapidly. Where are those trials going on? The answer is worldwide. Of course, the bulk of them are happening in the United States, but they are happening worldwide. And if you did a shot of this for, frankly, just about any field within life sciences right now, you'd see that same distribution. There are a lot of trials going on worldwide. Okay, so let's look at some transplant metrics. Oops, sorry. There we go. Key metrics in the field, as I mentioned, we've done 25,000 cord blood transplants to date. We did 4,000 in 2010. That's a 9% increase over 2009 and a 100% increase over 2005. The compound annual growth rate for transplants is pretty dramatic. The takeaway message here is the field is growing pretty dramatically. Multi-cord transplants have increased 25% since 2010. We're going to hear from folks from the NMDB, and I'm sure they'll provide some data on, or some nuance on that data for you. And there are over 60 diseases that are currently being treated with cord blood. Comparison of cord blood to bone marrow. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these characteristics. The key reasons that transplant surgeons are choosing cord blood over bone marrow have to do with the speed with which you can identify a transplantable unit and the lower risk of graft versus host disease. The downside for using cord blood is engraftment time. Your patient is exposed for a longer period of time before restoration of the immune system when you're using cord blood, but there are a number of technologies currently being developed that would reduce that engraftment time down to the 14-day level, the 14 to 18-day level that you're currently seeing for bone marrow or peripheral blood. So I suspect some of the more dramatic announcements you're going to see over the next 12 to 24 months will be about increases in engraftment times. And when that happens, you're going to see even a larger spike of cord blood. Cord blood is rapidly taking over bone marrow and peripheral blood in the hematopoietic restoration market for the simple reason that it presents a lower risk profile for GVHD. NMDB data on transplants shows a fairly dramatic increase in cord blood and a decrease in bone marrow. Also, peripheral blood, of course, is growing. We'll hear again from the NMDB folks, and they will give you some more nuance on this data. Clearly, cord blood is the preferred cell source for pediatric patients. Okay, and cord blood transplants. Adult transplants are the fastest growing population. 58%, a majority of the transplants last year were cord blood, 2010. 58% of the cord blood transplants went to adults. Okay. All right, why? Because transplant outcomes have improved pretty dramatically since 2003. Okay. That's a pretty significant growth from 2003 to 2010. Why is that happening? It's happening because of three key things. We've got improved HLA matching. First, we have a larger number of units available for transplant surgeons to select from. We've got improved HLA matching, so the opportunity for a transplant surgeon to be able to identify a unit that fits his or her patient very closely is good. We've got advancements in conditioning regimes that allow adult patients who are otherwise a little ill to be able to be conditioned in a way that enables the transplant surgeon to use the cord blood, and post-transplant supportive care has increased pretty dramatically. And so those have all led to transplant outcomes increasing dramatically, which of course has contributed to the overall growth of the field. Okay, clinical outcomes directly related to a couple of things. TNC counts, CD34 counts, and the size of the unit. That's the quality of the tissue. And then matching criteria has improved. Or increased. 4 out of 6 matches is the standard analysis, although people are doing 8 out of 10 matches or 8 out of 10 analysis. Folks are looking to match both race and ethnicity in addition to the HLA and genetic matching. Some banks are actually doing genetic profile of their tissue and making that data available for transplant surgeons so they can identify a closer match. Okay. Cord shipments by TNC count for adults would show most of the units, I jumped ahead here. Most of the units for adults had TNC counts of 150 or above. The current threshold, if you're doing a search, if you're operating a bank, you've probably seen that units that have TNC counts below 150 are generally not being selected by transplant surgeons. So the current threshold really is about TNC counts of 150. Okay, and what does that say about the utilization rates and where the inventory is coming from? A lot of the banks that are out there, I'm on the board of StemSite, our bank. We've been collecting tissue into our bank for 10, 15 years. When we first began collecting tissue, the TNC thresholds were not as clearly defined, and we collected tissue that didn't necessarily meet that 150 threshold. That is true, I think, of virtually every public bank that's been in business for some time, and what you would expect from that is that there are a significant amount of tissue in the public banks that don't meet the current TNC thresholds, and this data bears that out. 82% of all of the shipments came from 31% of the available inventory. Okay. Tells you a little bit about what might happen with the remaining inventory or where those banks are going to be as a financial model, but it's an interesting stat. Okay. Therapeutic applications, there are over 60 diseases being treated. We will hear a significant amount. We're going to have some, again, great presentations on some of the current research and some of the applications, so I'm not going to go into any further detail on that. There's just a lot of activity there. Typically, it's been the blood disorders that were treated. Here's a NMDB data on the leading disorders, the malignancies, and this is that same data on, whoops, I apologize, on the non-malignant disorders. Okay, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. The data will all be available in my slides, and we're going to hear a lot on this as the day progresses. That search that I did last night, and I do quite frequently, reveals a whole host of conditions that are the subject of trials, and those are the conditions. Again, we're going to hear a lot about that. Okay, so let me just talk for a second about banking models. The business of cord blood banking has evolved in the last 10 years, 5 years actually. One of the primary things that's happening is the operators of private banks or for-profit banks are realizing they need to augment their revenue stream. And one of the ways that they're doing that is that they are looking for other sources of tissue that they can store. And so tissue related to the birthing process would be the natural first choice. So of course, you're seeing many banks offering the opportunity to store either Wharton's jelly or the entire cord. Placental tissue is also a tissue that folks are storing. Amniotic fluid, autologous bone marrow, mobilized peripheral blood, IPS lines. Some of you may have seen the announcement from Shinya Yamanaka's group in Japan that they are building a set of lines, IPS lines. They're going to try to build, they've done a genetic analysis and they've looked at it and they said if we were to develop 100 IPS lines, we could treat 80 to 85% of the population with those lines, so we're going to start storing those lines. And so folks are banking IPS lines. I mentioned peripheral blood, ALDH cells, that's the aldogen folks, adipose tissue, of course, and finally menstrual blood. So there are lots of different tissue types that people are storing. I suspect that 10 years from now, in these kind of conferences, we're going to be talking about biobanking as opposed to cord blood banking. Because the business models will evolve in a way that will necessitate other tissue types within the banks. Okay, and then finally, let me talk about what I think is the integrated business model that is likely going to be the surviving business model or one of the surviving business models for cord blood banks that will be successful long term. This is a pretty brutal business if you're a private cord blood bank. The number of banks that are your competitors are fairly large. Hitting critical mass is important. The regulatory environment is getting more severe. So it's a pretty tough business. There are right now, I think, in the order of 15 to 20 public cord blood banks. The public markets have been absolutely brutal with cord blood banks. Most of those banks trade at their cash value. They're getting at most 1x their revenue multiple as a market cap. So the markets have not been particularly favorable in terms of valuing these businesses because cord blood banking is perceived to be simply a service business. And as a service business, given the competition and the price pressure, analysts have determined that the banking model is not, the standalone private banking model is not a great one. I think honestly the only cord blood bank out there that gets any real respect in the market right now is China Cord. China Cord trades right now, I think yesterday they were trading at about 2 times their revenue multiple. Most of the other banks, as I said, are at cash value or less than their revenue multiple. So the public markets are not particularly favorable. There is one bank that trades at a substantial premium to its revenue multiple, and that's MetaPost. MetaPost is a Korean bank. MetaPost has a business model that is somewhat unique. It happens to be the business model of the company I'm on the board of, StemSite. It's public banking, private banking, and therapeutics. Okay, and MetaPost trades in a range that is upwards of 20, even 20 times their revenue multiple. Their current market cap's about $750 million on about $40 million of revenue, 35, 40 million. What that says is that the business community, the public markets, think that a different business model is necessary in order to be successful in the cord blood business. Whether that's true or not, whether that's an important data point, I think it's an important data point. Whether ultimately it's true or not, I think it is. I think ultimately we're going to see a consolidation in the industry, and I think we're going to see folks migrating to a business model that looks like this, where you have public banking, private banking combined together with a therapeutics program built on top. And ultimately, what you will see is not just the therapeutics program, but clinical facilities that offer treatments from the tissue stored by that business. So you have essentially a not purely vertically integrated business, but a business where you're both collecting and storing the tissue, you're conducting clinical trials, and then you're treating patients. Those cell therapy centers are likely to be standalone centers that are modeled after the ambulatory surgery center model and other sections in life sciences and healthcare. That, by the way, happens to be the most profitable part of the life care or life sciences sector right now. It's relatively capital efficient. You can get them set up, and so you could leverage the tissue that you'd stored in your banks, so you have this virtuous cycle, as some of the analysts like to say. So I think that is a business model where the industry is going. We'll come back in 5 years and see whether I'm right or not. But I think that's kind of where the industry is going. And with that, I will stop